Alright, you want to do the introduction here?
I think you should do it.
Alright, hello and welcome back to another episode of the Hoppean Book Club. We're back from our um, hiatus. Um, this podcast is about going over Austrian economics and libertarianism. It's for people to read and follow along. We want a discussion with the chat, so post questions. Let's see what else is there. We also want suggestions of books with the theme being Austrian economics and libertarianism. Other schools of libertarianism could be covered in the future, but we will do that after getting the main books of the Austrian school done. Um, don't worry if it's not like what you'd consider the central book of Austrian economics or libertarianism. As the suggestion that we covered last time, it wasn't really central, but it proved a good point about Austro-libertarianism, so it was a good book to go over. Yeah. Um, yeah, so this week we're going over Socialism by Ludwig van Mises. We're doing the preface, the foreword, the introduction, and chapter 1. Um, hold on a second. I gotta do a few things in the background here. So, let's do that. Okay, and there we go. We have the chat popped out, and we'll be able to read and listen to it. So the subtitle of this book is a Sociological and Economic Analysis. It's interesting that Mises makes the argument that sociological and economic analysis needs to happen for cultural, historical, and what was the other one? Analysis. Which we'll get into in this episode. But do you have anything to say on that? Oh, I should introduce this. I'm Colton, and with me today is Bart. Um, don't know where he
Hello.
is. Okay. So let's see if we can wait for people to file in before we get going here. So how are you guys in chat feeling? Do, 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 do. Don't really see anyone in chat. Oh, we have one watching now. Hello, whoever you are. Yeah, the really interesting thing is that the forward's written by Hayek, which really goes into the history surrounding the book. And then but Mises really didn't want to get into any historical events because that would totally date the book as soon as that event passed. And so he tried to just have a universal law surrounding socialism with regards to economics and sociology. Blah. Oh, hey, Emo. Yeah, I don't know what's really going on here, but hey, I hate Yankees. That's a very familiar feeling over at the Hoppean. The heck is going on with Brunt? Hey, Volnost.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Hello. Okay. I'm assuming chat can hear me. Yeah, no problem, Emo. It next time, just read this because really chapter one is some basic theory about property, and we'll get into some other things with chapter one. So okay, going back to the preface, it's about really the importance of the book historically and how it really helped many people find Mises, as well as get people to turn away from socialism. But I can't hear you. You're going green, but you're not speaking. So, anyways, socialism altered the outlook of many university students in Germany. Many saw their societies destroyed and wished to improve them. Socialism told them they were looking in the wrong direction. Such contemporaries were Hayek, Wilhelm Wopke, and Lionel Robbins, who were very, very influential liberals in Mises' time, especially his later years. I'm thinking like the 40s and 50s. So, yep. Mises was best known at this time as a fighter against inflation in the Austrian government. He was most well known at that time for writing A Theory of Credit and Money. Oh, Money and Credit. I think I have that written backwards. A book that successfully applied Austrian marginal utility analysis theory of money. Max Weber described it as the most acceptable work on the subject. Um, Max Weber being way more of a theoretician than Mises or Karl Menger. That's very high praise. Um, What's really interesting about Mises is that he was not only a theoretician and very, very good at that, but because he developed his intellect just from a first as a student of history, he was also very, very good at historical economics, uh, ec- economic histories, and he was able to show trends and how the theory really explained historical trends. So that was so Mises studied economics and social problems before the First World War. He was led to these topics by social politic, which is similar to the Fabian socialism that the likes of Elon Musk said he supported a few years ago. I have to change it to push to talk. Um, okay. Apparently, Bort was perfectly fine until we went live, which is just great. So, It wasn't until Mises read Carlo Mango's Principles of Economics that he truly began to appreciate economics, became an economist. Before then, he was studying on the German Historical School of Economics. Um, the German Historical School was more a school of political economy than economy. It's much more. It's like Keynesianism today, where it's not so much that it's a very good formulation of economics. That is the reason why it is used, is because it is able to justify um, st- state policies. And I believe we have Blunt back.
Hey,
Hey, so welcome back.
sorry guys.
Yeah, no problem. I have no idea why your mic decided to cut out right at the beginning of the stream, like as soon as I hit live. And then I asked you if you wanted to do the introduction. After that, you just went dead.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I have no idea why that happened. Um, so, yeah, so for those who don't know, the German Historical School of Economics believed that there were no such thing as universal economic laws, and that every era in history had its own economic laws that you had to apply to it. And this allowed the Kaiser to basically push through whatever policies he wanted, because he could say it's a new era and there's going to be new economic laws, and these economic laws are going to show that this policy is the best policy, essentially, or is going to lead to the best outcomes. But mic is cursed. Yeah, it. We were fixing that before stream, but apparently it's now feels like he's 5 feet away from the mic.
It doesn't sound good anymore?
Now, I mean, to me it does now, like when you just spoke, but I have no idea how, how it sounds to the audience. Your sound is good from my mixer, like in terms of volume. So, Mises' initial interests were historical, and he retained a breadth of historical knowledge rare amongst theoreticians. This is what I was speaking about earlier. It was actually his dissatisfaction with the manner historians treated economic history that led him to economic theory, which I feel like that's almost paralleled with Tom Woods. What would you say, Brent?
I'm not sure what you mean.
Woods got his PhD in history, but thus far he is almost exclusively
Right.
written on economics.
Yeah. No, I know what you mean now. I get that. Yeah, I understand.
So, many of the ideas presented in this book were developed further in a private seminar he started at the same time as the publishing of this book. Hayek joined this seminar 2 years after the start of it. Reception of this book was either indifferent or hostile, despite getting a small loyal following. This is actually very, very similar to how Rothbard and Hoppe have treated books. It's the books themselves are not the end all be all of their thoughts on the matter. They've had lectures and such that went into developing the books, but also they developed them further after they had written the books, and that's why Hoppe especially has things like the Great Fiction, which predates A Short History of Man, even though a lot of what's in the Great Fiction is in the History of Man. And then you have things like the Myth of National Defense, which also goes over some of the things that the Great Fiction does, as well as the private production of defense, which basically takes a chapter of the Great Fiction and just refines it. It seems a lot that Hoppe has been refining everything he's been talking about since the 1990s and 1980s. So, it seems like Mises was very much the same in this aspect. So Mises's ideas ripened over the 2 decades, culminating in Human Action in 1940. Mises's arguments were not easily apprehended. When one read the opponents to his economic calculation theory, one gets the impression they did not understand why calculation was necessary. They saw it as just figures needed to plug and chug in some economic equation rather than the ability to calculate at all. Such that if they could just get numbers from somewhere, they could figure out what the numbers should be and, basically work backwards and forwards until there's an equilibrium.
Who were some of the biggest critics of this work, do you think, at the time? From what perspective were they writing? Like, what was their economic school that thought they were advocating? I mean, some kind of interventionism, obviously, but I didn't know if it was like German school type people or.
So the German school was dying in 1922. It was, especially with the economic calculation problem, it was mainly socialists and Marxists that would be debating them. If you remember the great economic calculation debates in the 1930s. Bullets say attack where you at to test your mic.
Huh?
Bullets say attack where you at to test your mic.
Attack, where you at? Is it working?
Yeah, it seems to be working for me. Yeah, you just sound quiet to me, but then when I check my volume on my mixer, you're just fine, so I have no idea.
Hold on. Does this sound better?
It does. It does.
Okay, good.
So, Mises learned that it was his methodology which was what separated him from his detractors, and in order to convert them, he would need to impress upon them an altogether different methodology. And this is why later in life, in the 1950s, he wrote his epistemological problems in economics, which I actually really want to get to because that seems way more interesting to me than fine details of economic theory.
Yeah.
So socialism is one of the classics now that is taken for granted, and this is, we're talking about the book Socialism, but it's highly relevant much after the time period it was written in. So Hayek was writing this in the 1960s, I believe, and Socialism 40 years later was still a very, very influential book because he went at it from a pure analysis perspective instead of a political polemic type of deal. Mises believed that liberalism was brought about because people rationally knew of its benefits, but Hayek believed that people quote-unquote chose the free market only insofar as people grew a preference for something that already existed. Mises eventually emancipated himself from that rationalist constructivist view. And I gotta wonder if Mises's belief here was mainly due to the people who he surrounded himself with, because especially with high intelligence people, they typically only interact with other high intelligence people, and therefore they kind of think that they are normal. Meanwhile, the vast majority of the masses are short-sighted, envious, greedy, etc., etc. Um, and they won't really think about things in terms of ideals and such. They just want what's best for them.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think it was Mises dealing with socialists that kind of freed him from this perspective. And hi, Neil. Mises regarded himself as a liberal, um, which no one can do now, as Joseph Schumpeter put it. The enemies of liberties, as a supreme but unintended compliment, have thought it wise to appropriate this label. And I actually really believe that this is true of libertarianism today, is that the enemies of liberty have basically co-opted the term libertarian to push their agenda, and therefore you can't, you shouldn't really call yourself one. You have the likes of the Libertarian Party, you have the Reason, you have Cato, you have all these open borders types, you have just so many libertarians who aren't true Rothbardians. They kind of just play on whatever Rothbard quotes they can find to justify their positions, and then kind of have their own agenda.
Yeah, I 100% agree. The term, that's why like all this stuff is contextual with like using the term liberal.
Yep. And that's
it's the same. It's going to be the same way with using the term libertarian. Reading old Rothbard work. I mean, even it applies now more or less, but especially in the future, it's like a term that won't be used by the people who identify most with the work, probably.
Yep. Yeah, no. So the preface to the second English edition is actually much shorter, and it's written in 1950. It is very interesting that the preface to the second German edition, written in the 1930s, was like 3 or 4 times longer. I think that just kind of shows that Mises is not nearly as comfortable writing in English. Or it could be the fact that the preface to the second German edition was already going to be included in the second English edition. I can't tell.
Yeah. Full disclosure, I haven't read any of these prefaces. This book, I started the introduction. I read the introduction in the first chapter.
Okay. But
so you're the one who read these prefaces.
Yep. That's fine. I've done a good job on summarizing it, so it's just, I don't know. You should be able to understand it.
Yeah.
The world today. So the beginning of the preface to the second English edition is: the world today is split between two camps, the communists and the anti-communists, but they both aim at the abolishment of private enterprise and the private ownership of the means of production, and at the establishment of socialism. They want to substitute totalitarian control for the market economy. The paternal care of the welfare state will reduce all people to the status of bonded workers bound to comply with the orders of the planning authority. And here he's talking about both fascists and communists. And the fascists like to say that they are anti-communists, but when they mean that they are anti-international socialists. They are just national socialists.
Yeah, and it's exactly the same thing that Antifa does now, where they say you're either Antifa or a fascist. And it's like, well, Antifa is just a label that they just mean communists, like full Marxists, Leninists, or whatever. Like that's just what they mean by Antifa. They just mean communists.
Yep.
So it's the same thing within this sentence of communist and anti-communist. It just means fascist.
Yep. Neither is there a difference between self-styled progressives and the Italian fascists and German Nazis. This actually reminds me of FDR's Practical Socialism quote, where he talks about in the early 1930s that Mussolini's Italy is quote unquote practical socialism. And he was drawing a comparison there to the USSR in that impractical socialism because it had famines. This is just a reminder that progression in politics means progression towards socialism. And so the progressives and the communists, they agree on everything except for how to arrive at socialization of the means of production and the abolishment of private enterprise and private ownership. The communists believe in violent revolution. The progressives believe in a slow march towards their aim.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Mr. Perón seeks to do in Argentina is to replicate the New Deal and the Fair Deal, which will result in full socialism unless it is stopped. With how South America has went basically full socialist between the 1930s and the 1970s, I think that is a very, very true statement. It wasn't really until Pinochet that the first South American country went away from socialism. So, he ends by saying that the real conflict is not who should run the totalitarian apparatus, but whether or not socialism should supplant the market economy, and that real conflict of who should run the totalitarian apparatus, he's talking about the fascists and the socialists.
Yeah, it's the same story today, essentially.
Yep. So, preface to the second German edition, socialists began thinking that any exchange beyond the village level was artificial, but as soon as the English free traders showed the efficacy of international trade, did socialists develop national and eventually world socialism. And this really shows the backwards nature of socialists, is that they did not want any trade beyond the immediate small town. And it was only after the market economy showed that trade between nations was beneficial did they start rethinking their ideas. So socialism's conception was brought about first by what Marx would call utopian socialists. The utopians would develop schemes for human implementation of socialism, but the discussions did not go in their favor. The utopians did not develop systems that would withstand criticism by economists and sociologists. It was at this time Marx appeared. Adept as he was in the Hegelian dialectic, he soon found an out for socialists. So the Hegelian dialectic is a very, very dangerous tool, because it basically allows you to, through esoteric argumentation, justify just about anything. It is essentially just a propaganda tool, and a means to confuse people. But do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, that's basically the whole way we communicate ideas is through language. So if you can obfuscate meanings or come up with very like ethereal concepts to kind of mask or distort what you're proposing, you can kind of create any reality or make people believe anything. You can use language in a way, and you can create arguments that don't have any real substance to them. They kind of just have like an emotional or misleading appeal.
Yep. And so Marx's out had 3 lines of procedure. First, it denied that logic was universally valid for all mankind and for all ages. It thought thought it stated, was determined by the class of the thinkers in ideological superstructure of their class interests. And so this is why, if you ever talk to a Marxist and you try to explain why Marxism or equality or anything like that is wrong or flawed, they might say that's a bourgeois, that you're using bourgeois language and he's using proletarian language. And this is exactly why. They don't believe that logic is something that is true for everyone. And you can see this most fully implemented in postmodernism, which is a realm of discussion far beyond this, but if you just know about postmodernism, that is essentially what it is. But instead of it being based on classes, it's based on the individual. So, secondly, it laid down that the dialectical development led of necessity to socialism, and that the aim and end of all of history was the socialization of the means of production and the expropriators of the expropriators, the negation of negation. And so this is this leads into the third principle. Finally, it was ruled that no one should be allowed to put forward, as the utopians had done, any definite proposals for the construction of the socialist promised land. Since the coming of socialism was inevitable, science would best renounce all attempts to determine its nature. And so, because socialism was inevitable, there was no need to explain how it would work, because it wouldn't be an end necessarily to strive for. It would just be an end that happens in and of itself. Thus, let's see. Yeah, and so this is also how Marx gets around criticism, is that he doesn't actually explain how socialism is to be implemented. And so economists and sociologists can't critique it, just because it's something not definite and something not defined that he's proposing. However, Böhm-Bawerk wrote the close of Marx and his system, and he was very, very good in that. So do you have anything to say about the three outs?
Yeah, it's funny how there's still I mean, there's still tactics and all that stuff is still used today when you try to get, when you're talking to.
Hello?
You know what I mean?
I didn't hear anything after when you're talking to. Can you speak up a little bit?
Can you hear me?
I can when you speak up.
I was just saying, it's funny. This is still the same tactics that are used today, of just when you're trying to nail down someone on okay, so how would a price arise for this good or something, it's always kind of hand waved away as not being an important question or something. It's always this kind of esoteric hey, just the common people will know and all this stuff. It's just this very this obfuscation of trying to discuss how things would be.
Yep.
They have no predictions on. They can't make. They don't make any claims of what it would look like how things would be allocated. It's the same stuff today.
Yeah. The immediate and complete acceptance of this doctrine cannot be underestimated. While many sects of Marxists believe their own form of Marxism is the true one, and that all others are not true socialism, they all hold these basic tenets. The incomparable success of Marxism is due to the prospect it offers of fulfilling those dream aspirations and dreams of vengeance, which have which have been so deeply embedded in the human soul since time immemorial. It promises a paradise on earth. And that's really the appeal to this, because it's so hard to actually pin down and criticize. It's promises of equality, of morality, and of post-scarcity, which is what we'll get into later, is something that is very alluring to people who don't understand that it is foolhardy to say, oh, well, we're just not going to define what it is, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, the stuff about promising paradise on Earth, like, it just reminds me of there's this recent like audio clip that was leaked of someone involved with like the Black Lives Matter organization in some way. I'm not sure their exact position. I can link this below or something. But she asked everyone in the room she's talking to that she's like doing like some sort of recruitment for them. And she has them like all close their eyes, and then she just describes this world, and she's like, just picture a world where, you know, you have unlimited this, and everyone's treated this way, and, you know, people will live in this way. Like, it was just like, I don't remember specifically what she said. It was kind of like a couple months ago I heard it, but she's just going through like, and it's literally sounds like something for children, but she's just having them close their eyes, and she just paints this picture, this end result of this utopia. Like, literally, that's like the utopian socialist. Like, that's the thing. And there's no no one challenges her, obviously, but like, I guarantee you couldn't get her to explain how you get from point A to point B. Or like what would, like, what, you know, okay, what happens if someone has this and they don't want to like, they want to use it exclusively, like, you know, like, there's no discussion of like conflicts over scarce resources or like any of this stuff. It's just like they don't grapple with it at all.
Right. And this is actually a failure on their part, because many of them will say that scarcity is only an issue because of the capitalist structure. Which, if you understand what scarcity is, you'll understand that it can't come about by the structure. Or if it did, you could literally just go out, live in the forest, and be much wealthier than you would in society.
Yeah.
Okay. So, we must not only analyze the problems of socialism, but break down the biases. Any man who advocates socialistic measures is looked upon as the friend of the good, the noble, and the moral. In short, he is viewed as a man who selflessly serves his own people. But anyone who scrutinizes socialism by scientific means is a champion of the evil principle. This way of thinking regards the question of whether socialism or capitalism will better serve the public welfare as settled in advance. Thus, the economic investigations are not met with arguments, but with the moral pathos. Socialism is an article of faith for many today. Capitalist society is like economic democracy, wherein all people, in buying or abstaining from buying, decide what to produce and how. This is different from the actual term economic democracy, where these things are determined by the producers. Which is kind of interesting, because that's kind of how all republic/democracy works, is how much and how to produce, let's say, the U.S. Postal Service, is not something determined by our use of the U.S. Postal Service, but it's determined by government bureaucrats, which in this case would be the producers. And it's same thing with the police. It's determined by the police, not by consumers.
Yeah, there's an economic calculation type problem there too. It's not exactly the same thing, but there is still, because they have some inputs, but they still kind of don't. They're not responding to the market.
It is. Hoppe talks about this in the theory of socialism and capitalism, that if you have no prices at the high, in the capital of goods things, even if you have prices, let's say for stamps, at the higher levels you will face the economic calculation problem, and that's kind of what the U.S. Postal Service um, faces. It's not quite
Yeah,
true because there are some prices, but it for the
yeah,
large majority of cases it wasn't true until UPS and FedEx and all of those people
right.
started competing.
Yeah, and then there's the people who can't compete, like with judges or court systems or something. Like they have, so it's not exactly. I say it's not exactly the socialist or economic calculation problem, because like you have prices for like how much, like you have like a price on like their labor or like what it costs to, to hire a construction company to build the courthouse per se, but you don't have any market signal on like, okay, for a population in a town, like how many courthouses should there be, like how many judges, like they're not responding to like a voluntary like market like response. They're just kind of like guessing based on like projections, and it's not really like there's no back and forth like market equilibrium. They're trying
Yeah,
to like
and to kind
reach
of
by maximizing profit and all this stuff because they don't operate for profit.
and to demonstrate this, just walk into your local DMV and see what the wait time is like, and imagine any other customer service wait time like that.
Or yeah, if it was any private business and they just had one and it was like that busy all the time, they would clearly open up a second location or open up
Or
more people there.
yeah,
Have staff to add that one or something. But either way, I'm saying like if the demand was that high, you would see a response from the capitalist that was the entrepreneur. Like, but that's not the case with the state manages
yeah.
like something.
I remember back when Dick, back in the early 2000s and late 90s, where they would literally grocery stores would literally pull people from different areas to man cashiers if the lines were getting long. That
Well,
doesn't happen nearly as much today because of the automated stuff, because where I live has higher minimum wages than other places in the country. But yeah, I remember when there was actual humans at cashiers that they would open up more cashiers if the lines got long.
right.
So, socialism is an article of faith for many today. As one of the quotes that Mises doesn't cite in here, but I know, Marxism is the opium of the intellectuals. And
It's a
so
good quote.
it's a way of thinking that you're smart without actually having to do anything, because you're able to wave away any disagreements or criticisms.
Yeah.
So, Mises actually writes this after talking about how capitalist society is like a democracy. The average man is better informed and less corruptible in decisions he makes in the marketplace than when he votes in political elections.
Yeah. Well, and then one of the reasons is you have direct results for what
Mm-hmm.
you purchase.
Yep.
You have
Instead of the cost being socialized, the costs are privatized to the individual or to the family.
right.
And so I thought that was very, very intelligent, and I can't quite believe that he's not an anarchist after believing such things like that. But
There are
yeah,
sorry.
we're gonna get into anarchism in chapter 1, so we should
Yeah,
leave that
I was
discussion
gonna
till
say.
then.
Okay, good.
So this book is a scientific inquiry, not a political polemic, and that's kind of why it has stood the test of time. You have things like the economic calculation problem that is in here. You have things like destructionism, and how many on the left and on the socialist side just love destroying things, which I think is very referential to today's society and the past 100 days of riots we've had in this country.
Mm-hmm.
You have warfare as a aspect of socialism, including racial warfare, which I thought was interesting that he would even bring up racial warfare. And yeah. He also brings up that only theoretical inquiries which get to the bottom of things have any practical value, and that many people, when discussing ideas, they give it a cursory glance and don't really try to get to the bottom of it. And therefore they don't really have any actual... There's nothing valuable that they're saying. So... not much to say there. It's just interesting that he would bring that up, because some say that the intellectual critiques of socialism are pointless since the masses will not understand them. Mises was not of this view, obviously, because he's written so many books for the layman. I mean, I haven't read all of Human Action, but I've read parts of it, and it's not that difficult to understand.
I haven't, but I haven't started it yet. I'm getting around to it.
Yeah. So, but we've also read. Actually, we haven't read anything by Mises yet. But
we read the cultural views, but those weren't necessarily. That wasn't necessarily by him.
No, that was by Jeffrey Tuckle.
And Rockwell.
Yeah. But from what I've read of Mises, he's not actually hard to understand. You just have to understand some economics going into it. And that's what I think a lot of people mistakenly do with Mises, Rothbard, and Hoppe, is that they have no idea what economics is when they go into it. And so when they say something, people just have no idea what they're even talking about. But even reading something like Economics 1 Lesson will really clue you into these things.
Yeah, I would say that's like one of the most important things for really anyone who wants to get into any of this stuff to read first, because it completely, I mean, that's like, I think, one of the best books that's ever been written for the reason, not that it has the most insights, but just that it's absolutely sets you up for understanding economics.
Some people say it's dated, and it is if you want to talk about economics to the average person, because the things covered in that book aren't really like topics of political discussion today. However, all of those programs he's talking about still exist in some form or another today.
Yeah. Well, and certain parts are still like I think part 5, the Curse of Machinery. I mean, with all the automation stuff and the whole Andrew Yang movement, like that's all still hyper relevant now.
Yeah.
But I mean, people might not know what a glazier is or something.
Yeah, people might not know like what parity prices are and things like that. But we still have subsidies for the farming industry, and that analysis still holds up.
And especially with all the, I think it's the second part about war being another kind of broken window fallacy stuff.
Yep.
About how people still today say World War II got us out of the Depression.
Then not only say that, but they say things like Raytheon selling weapons to the Saudis is popping up on economy.
Right. And the whole thing with about it's the term economics to most, I don't want to say to most people, I don't know the percentage, but to a lot of people, they just don't know what it is, like at all, like what it actually is. They think it's just like money, or just means something to do with money. Like they don't understand that it has to do with like trade-offs or time preference or anything. So, they'll be like, someone will say like, "Oh, Bernie Sanders' economics doesn't make sense," and then he'll, he could, in a debate or something. I'm saying someone debating him, and he could be like, "My program costs this much money. I say we tax this many people at this percentage, and then we have the money to pay for it, and it's covered. Boom, that's economics." And it's like not analyzing the counterfactual, not analyzing like what people would have to withgo, like what the money would have been spent, the unseen, yeah, Bastiat, all that, like they don't know that economics. They're just like economics. Yeah, the program costs $10,000, and I can come up with $10,000 by doing this government program. See, there you go. That's economics. It's covered for. Like economics is when you have enough money to pay for something. Like that's just like people don't know. They don't understand like all like the basic stuff. That's why I just say economics in one lesson. Or
yeah, the great thing about the Austrian method is that it really goes into the Austrian capital structure, Austrian production theory, and all of that. So you actually have to understand how the economy works before you start analyzing it. Meanwhile, when you go into Keynes, it's just a bunch of equations, and you just kind of plug and chug.
Yeah. Yeah, people don't understand. Like people will debate like policy wonk type people. Like now, like people who are pretty popular will debate economics back and forth, and they don't even understand like simple like the basic like capital theory or anything, or understand about like discounted like labor, like it's a discounted
Marginal, discounted labor product. Sorry, discounted
yeah,
marginal revenue product of labor. Blah.
Right. Or just that like future goods have a lower value than present goods, or like even just simple stuff like that. They don't know, like they don't understand it, and they'll still try to debate on like why the Fed should cut rates or something. Like
yeah, and
this will boost spending, like
it will in the short term, in the same way as blowing all your savings right now will boost your monthly spending this month's spending.
Right.
But if something happens to you in the future, you don't have those savings anymore.
Yeah.
So, anyways.
Let's jump into the introduction. Sorry to get off on a tangent.
Yeah, no problem. We're actually making great time, so. Introduction, the success of socialist ideas. Socialism is the watchword and catchword of our day. If one accepts that the system based on private property does not sufficiently consider the interests of the community, or that it limits production and therefore demands interventionism, then one has accepted the principle of the socialist program. If one's objection to socialism is that it is impossible due to human nature, or that it is inexpedient to implement right now, then one confesses that one has capitulated to socialist ideas. And this is really the crux of the conservative failure that is covered in Egalitarianism as a Revolt Against Nature by Rothbard. It is the pushing away of the giving up of the moral ideal to the socialists and just saying it's impractical that has led us down this path. Because when people know something is impractical but they believe it to be morally justified, they will say, well, we can withstand a little bit lessening of the overall wealth of society so we can do what is just. And this will continue and continue and continue.
100,000%. I mean, I couldn't agree more with that sentiment. It's they always kind of like see like, yeah, like I think they like buy into their like language, like, yeah, you know what, that does sound good. And I actually would like that, but I just don't think we can make it happen. Or like, and it's like, no, you can't even do that much. Like that, it doesn't sound good, and here's why. Like that whole like, well, communism sounds good on paper, or something. It's like, no, it doesn't. Like you can't even once you've yielded that, you've kind of lost the whole game.
Yep. Yeah, so hey Eric, welcome. Well, just getting to the introduction, so, yeah. So he also brings up the National versus International Socialists, and he says that the National Socialists aren't any less socialist than the International Socialists. And one of my favorite sayings on this is that National Socialism is a problem with borders, and International Socialism is a problem without borders.
Yeah. They
Go ahead.
I'll say they both make the same fundamental mistake. I mean, of socialism. Like clearly that's the Venn diagram there. That's just obvious. But it's like they posture themselves, I'm trying to say, as two diametrically opposed things. Like these things couldn't be any more different. But it's like they both yield and accept like that the state is the best way of organizing society. Or, it has the ability, like it even not even can it do it, it can do it better than individuals.
Right. And it's kind of interesting because the International Socialists actually call themselves Marxists, but they often neglect Hegelian dialectics for the material dialectic. Meanwhile, the National Socialists, the fascists, have taken the Hegelian dialectic and made it all their own, and esoteric philosophy is their bread and butter.
Yeah,
and so when you're dealing with a fascist, he'll talk about wills and spirits and all of this other things. Meanwhile, a communist, a guy with a little red book from Mao, will be all about the material conditions of the worker and such things like that.
Mm-hmm. I've noticed that as well. Like, when I've listened to fascists, they're very like spiritual. I'm not using that as like a pejorative. I'm saying like they talk about like it's a very
it's
Hegelian type, like, yeah, it's a very like esoteric type, like, persuasion.
Right, and this is what Hegelian dialectics was all about. Was very, very spiritual and very, very esoteric formulations. And it's really interesting how the Marxists, the people who call themselves Marxists at least, have spun that into a material dialectic. So they've kind of like taken this propaganda tool that's all about being esoteric and just morphed it into being all about the material. All are socialists that view the socialistic society better economically and ethically to the private property-based society. Evidence that socialism is so complete in its win in converting people that we name moderate socialists like the liberals of England, cough cough Sargon, as anti-socialists because they do not wish to affect socialism immediately and completely. Our discourse is so warped that only those who wish to enact socialism completely in the here and now are considered socialists.
Yeah. That's the thing. And like, I mean, we're all guilty of it too, because sometimes it's not, like when you're speaking to average people, like, it's
you don't want to just come out and say you're all socialists.
A bunch of socialists, but like I do want to, but I know that like it would mean effectively nothing to them. But it is true. Like if you want to socialize this over having it be over a private property thing, like you're a socialist. But then you look at Donald Trump or something. America will never be a socialist country, or he'll be like, yeah, they're all these people are socialists over here on the left. They're a bunch of socialists, and then meanwhile, like. He'll have a speech like, we're going to have programs for, paternity leave and all this stuff. And just adding all these programs that didn't exist previously. And it's just like, this is the anti-socialist party now. Like, okay. Like that word just means people who are more socialist than me, but I'm still like I still advocate for socialist policies.
Right, and then you have the how should I put this? Then you have people like Sean, who everyone should know, who just calls everyone a socialist. Like he's just mask off you all a bunch of
Yeah,
socialists. And
literally.
I've tried to talk to him about this because it's just not good messaging.
Optics, bro.
Well,
No, but like
it's not even optics. It's just like it's
I know,
not
I'm just
effective
kidding.
when you're talking to someone to just call them a socialist, especially when
Right.
they're a boomulcon.
No, I know. I'm just kidding. But yeah, no, exactly. Like like you could talk to a MAGA Trump supporter type person, and you could, if you're just speaking in what the terms literally mean, you could make the case to them that like you are a socialist in such and such ways, and that would be like they would just be like, no, I'm not. Like they wouldn't care. They'd be like, shut up.
Yeah.
And it's why like and words change so much. That's why like if you want to communicate the same ideas, you can't use words like socialism in that way. Kind of, you can when you're talking with like your in group, but like to message to others, like you have to change words. It's like the same thing with liberalism. Like I would never be like,
I'm a liberal.
yeah, exactly like that. It's just it means an entirely different thing than what Mises meant by it. In the same way that like today you couldn't just be like,
I'm a
oh, Lindsey
libertarian.
Graham is. Yeah, I'm a libertarian, or you were just like, oh, these Republicans are socialists. Like people say that, and it's true. Like libertarians say that often, but it's not going to change anyone's mind to
Right.
libertarianism. They're just going to be like, yeah, that's you just say it to everybody.
And to borrow Filthy's words, there's a bunch of left libertarians that say that people like Gary Johnson have are just Republicans that have infiltrated the Libertarian Party. And there's a way in which that is true, in that Republicans are a bunch of leftists, and Gary Johnson is a leftist, and so they Gary Johnson is not as leftist as, let's say, Kamala Harris, but he's still fairly lefty, and therefore he belongs in the GOP.
Right. Well, because I mean, even a Republican is just someone who still advocates like a public ownership of government, and he's like running for political office and would not be intention of abolishing it.
Right, and they will give lip service to small government, but once they're in power, they basically govern like a Democrat. Campaigns.
Yeah, and then I mean, this gets off the trail, but it just goes back to the idea of like, even if you abolished a lot of the programs and you still had it in some sort of maybe like minarchy or right before it type thing, you still kind of concede that there is a like I'm just trying to think like logically, you just still kind of like, well, socialism is bad, but we should still socialize the most important thing.
Mm-hmm.
Which I think Mises, obviously wasn't publicly an anarchist, but he makes a lot of arguments that I think if you just presented back to him and argued at the time, I think just anarchist, like the term and everything. I don't think it was. I mean, it was just leftism. So I don't think I think he just was not into that. I think if he would have been around a little longer to he could have been.
Yep.
Changed.
So where did I leave off?
Evidence that socialism is so.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Oh, you go ahead, Alfred, because I was. Well, you go ahead. Yeah.
All right. Evidence that socialism is so complete in its win in converting people that we name. Oh no, mind. We just talked about that. The next section is the scientific analysis of socialism. The starting point of socialist doctrine is the criticism of the bourgeois order of society. Socialists do not understand the working of the economic mechanism, nor the functions of the various institutions of social order, which is based on the division of labor and the private ownership of the means of production. Critics have more than proved this. Many respond that capitalism has not resulted in utopia, but a proper response is not to show that fact, but to show that socialism is better than capitalism for the general welfare of the community. Um, and this is something that really pisses me off about monarchists, is that they'll be like, oh, neither socialism nor capitalism, and it's just like, okay, it's an either or situation. You can't have neither.
Yeah, and I think Rothbard talks about that really well, and I think Anatomy of the State, where he's just going over different types of ownership, and it's like it's either owned privately or it's not. Like, so it's either like you either own it or you don't. So it's either capitalism or it's publicly owned, or everyone, no
Yeah.
one owns it, quote
And
unquote.
Hoppe talks about this in the Socialism and Conservatism, and it's what the monarchist means by that is that capitalism has some flaws in it, and usually they mean flaws that would like be debunked by the progressive era or America's Great Depression that Rothbard has written. And so we need to not have capitalism, but we can't have socialism. So we're going to have this guild system of interventionism. And that's how we're going to solve the economic issues of our country. And it's just like, no,
Yeah.
that's just going to hold us back. Because we have that now, actually. Surprise, surprise, we have guild systems in the form of labor unions. We have fair pricing laws. We have, what else is in that system?
Well, like occupational licensing type stuff be some of it?
Yeah.
Or,
so it would be
or
occupational
like
licensing, especially labor unions, because what they talk about with guilds is basically apprenticeships that you have to go into a guild that is for your profession and get a license from that guild in order to work the guild rates in that city.
And then also maybe like medallion type systems, like how they do the taxis in New York or something.
Yeah, that's all licensing and such. But there's also fair pricing laws. There's also in that system there's regulations on how you do things, and so no one is really allowed to innovate on how the means of production are.
Right, and that goes back to the thing we brought it up twice now, but I haven't brought it up with this specifically, but with the terms and stuff of, we talked about libertarianism and stuff like that, but the term or capitalism. So many people say it's a preconception that we live under capitalism now. So therefore, well, you're advocating for this kind of crazy radical capitalism. Well, capitalism is not so great because X, Y, and Z, and it's always something that's not at all a function
of the free market.
Of the free market at all. So it's always like, but then there's still people who even claim to be supportive will still refer to what we live under as purely capitalism, and certainly elements of it.
Yeah, and this is really the trappings of the Cold War, where it was capitalist America versus the socialist USSR.
Right.
And so, actually, chat, let us know if you would like us to read Interventionism by Mises next. Or if not next, sometime in the future. I mean, I looked at this. I believe we have something like 15 weeks until we end this book, so we've got some time.
So I can, if you want to take a break, I can read the rest. Up until
sure, go ahead.
Because you've been reading a lot. I was just trying to. The separate logics of different classes protect Marxism from attack. The enemy isn't refuted, simply unmasked as the evil class. Marx and Engels never try to refute their critics with argumentation, but instead insulted, ridiculed, derided, slandered, and traduced them. I'm not sure what traduced means.
It means slandered or libeled.
Oh, okay. Yeah, and this still happens today with people who are,
you'll
racist, make an argument.
You're sexist, you're transphobic,
right.
You're homophobic.
Yeah. Sure.
I mean, that's the cultural aspect of this. They'll also say that you don't pay a fair wage, you take too much money,
Yeah.
Such things, and it's just like, they'll also talk about parachutes from companies for CEOs and things like that. I mean, if you know nothing about business and the economy, it seems kind of ridiculous that a failed CEO gets like $10 million to leave the company.
Right.
But you have to remember that the CEO is making risky decisions, and he will
Yeah.
only make those risky decisions if he has some insurance that he'll get a payout um, if they are the wrong decisions.
Yeah. Bob Murphy explained that best to me because I didn't understand that at the time either. But I don't remember exactly what he said now, but he had a really good explanation of the parachute thing.
Yeah.
And it's all just about risk, obviously, but the way he put it was really good. I'll have to find a link for that as well.
Yeah, yeah. Risk and time preference are two things that really really just opens your eye to so many things and shows why the left is so wrong about everything. I mean, I used it in my agorist article, but it's basically anything dealing with the left. It seems like doesn't take into account either or sorry either or both time preference or risk.
Right. No, not at all. And everything's so interconnected too. Like all that stuff is kind of like, it's like it doesn't work without the other part. Like they all go together so well. Like marginal utility and time preference, and then like it all kind of like it's all understand by economics, and they don't understand any of it. Like I don't even know if they know how to. They don't know how to even like refute it. That's why they just result. They don't. That's why the whole thing the part we just read, they just result to slander.
Yeah, I don't know if you remember Bob Murphy's critique of time preference.
I've listened to like a 2-hour podcast of him critiquing, I think, Böhm-Bawerk's pure time preference theory.
Right, and he's also critiqued marginal time preference theory. The issue I have with that is that he just basically believes that it's like a distance preference, that you would rather have something produced near you than far away from you, all other things being equal. That's how he explained it when I was listening to it. The only issue with this is that most people don't say that don't ignore this principle when they're arguing with people. They won't say like, oh yeah, you want your transportation costs to be as high as possible to be efficient in the economy. Or something crazy like that. But they will disregard time preference.
Mm-hmm.
And so, while it may be true from a pure theoretical perspective, it might not be completely necessary. It is necessary when you're dealing with anyone who is not an Austrian, because that is one of the big mistakes that they make, is time preference.
Yeah, it's a huge thing to understand, because I mean, even that I saw something on Twitter that was like about like, I don't know why we have interest on loans. The Bible prevents, or the Bible, says you shouldn't have usury, or you shouldn't charge interest on loans or whatever. I don't know the exact quote they cited. I know you're familiar with it, of course, but it's just like,
oh, I love especially Thomas Aquinas's argumentation against usury, because he says it's like printing money, and that in order to have usury, you must print money. And I'm just like, okay, so what you're talking about is the Fed in particular. You're not actually talking about like a bank giving out a loan with interest. You're talking about talking about how the Fed interrupts the interest loans and things like that, and it's just like, okay, that's immoral. It's not the actual loan itself, because that can be done away with pure time preference. However, I brought this up to an ortho bro, and he said, you're just using terminology that was developed specifically to get around this criticism of usury. And I'm just like, dude, the guys who developed economic theory here weren't even Christians. They probably didn't even care about usury, because it wasn't like it was a big deal of their time. Like in the 1800s, like there was no Catholics running around trying to ban all interest rates.
Right, and it persists all those groups as well. But then even just like Marxists or whoever who see it as exploitation or something, but it all just comes down to them just not understanding time preference, not understanding like valuing something more in the present.
Yeah,
I think one of Bobby's argument is that like there could be something where you value it less now and you value it more later. That's one thing I think he goes against the pure time preference theory.
Right, but he in order to do that, he violates the principle of all other things being equal.
Right.
And so
I forgot exactly what he said. I remember disagreeing with it as well at the time.
So
I'm still thinking that
it was about an ice cream cone, and whether would you rather have an ice cream cone today if today was in December in the middle of a blizzard?
I remember, or in July,
June,
right?
Or in
June, yeah. I remember now, yeah. And it's like you'd rather have it there, so obviously, you prefer to pay more for it to have it in a hot thing or something. But that's all the things being equal, you're changing the conditions.
Yeah. And so I understand the principle he's laying out, but you could do that with almost any economic principle, and that's what Esso and Filthy did in like their critiques of Hoppe's competition between states. Is like, oh well, you could look at the Soviet Union, which was just as big as the United States, and they aren't the same. And it's like that has nothing to do with this because of the other things being equal. You could also say that you could disprove the law of demand by saying if the demand increases, the price could decrease. Sorry, the price could increase. If the demand went up, the price could decrease if the supply just dwarfed the demand increase. And therefore, the law of demand is just complete bogus.
Right. Yeah, you're changing another factor in it for sure.
Yeah.
But yeah, just to get back to the main point is just that time preference is something that many groups that aren't Austrians they don't, not only do they purposely, I don't think it's something they even consider or think about.
Yeah. So anyways, let's get on with this.
The purpose of the prohibition to studying the work of the socialist community prevent the weakness of Marxist doctrines from coming to light. Such weakness might have dampened the masses' enthusiasm who sought social salvation from all earthly ills.
Right, and this is actually what I really kind of see as demonic, is that you're finding salvation in earthly things and getting away from earthly ills. And then you have Ecclesiastes. At the beginning of Ecclesiastes, he says, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. And he talks about how all the works on the earth is falsities. So what it means by, what in the Bible it means by vain is it is not true, it is a falsity. And so all your work on the earth is kind of a falsity in the fact that you're not actually profiting in the long run with anything you do on the earth, because there is a second life. And so that's the vanity of work in this life. And this salvation from all earthly ills is also a vanity. It is also vain.
Oh, I've never heard any of that.
Yeah. I got confused by it, so I had to go look up in one of my books the St. John Chrysostom commentary on Ecclesiastes, and that's what he talks about. And it's like, okay, that actually makes sense. And
go ahead.
I
thought it was like something he was referencing later in chapter 1, where he talks about like a critique of what he calls the liberal doctrine, is that it only concerns itself with earthly things. And you remember that part? And that's what I thought he was referring to, about how it's like, oh, well, all you guys care about is like, profit or private property or all this, these physical things. And, there's more to life than that or something like. And then I think he disposed of it in the next sentence of saying like, we don't claim there's not anything outside of this, but this is all that it was like we weren't intending to address those anyway. All we were addressing is like the scarcity, like the physical goods on the earth in the first place. So it's not even like a relevant point to bring that up. I think it's like that's later in chapter 1. I think I have a note on it maybe.
Right. But Mises wouldn't say that he's creating a promised land or finding salvation for the human race or anything like that. He would just be saying that this is a more reasonable way of going about things than any other way.
Mm-hmm.
And so, in that aspect, it's not vain because you're not trying to be like, oh, this is the salvation that we're looking for, instead of just saying like, okay, this is the best way of organizing society so long as we reside on the earth.
All right, I'm going to keep reading for a little bit. The supposed greatest socialist writer of Mises' time saw anyone wanting to bring light to the problems within the socialist economy as an evildoer that simply wishes to embarrass party socialism. Many opponents of Cohen regarded him as an intellectual.
Right, and you can just see how Cohen totally wasn't an intellectual. All he was a bully. Like, he would just say whatever he wanted. He would just say whatever he wanted, and anyone who criticized him would just be this evildoer.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I saw what you did there.
Thank you. For decades, this has led to socialists being able to gain ground when they eventually took control. They realized that they had no distinct idea what they were trying to achieve. A discussion on the problems of the socialist community is of the utmost importance. Economics, until now, has only analyzed the order based on private property. The gap must now be filled.
Right, so socialists not having any distinct idea of what they were trying to achieve is a direct consequence of their outs to economic and sociological critique. But I can't hear you.
I didn't say anything. I must have. If my thing's still lighting up, I'm sorry.
Oh, that's no problem. I didn't hear anything. You were just like blinking, like, you know.
I think it's just I have background noise.
Okay.
The question whether private ownership or socialization is to take place is political. Science cannot decide this. What science can do is examine the effects of institutions such that the foundation for understanding society can be laid. In the long run, in the long run, thought must determine action.
Yep. And so this is really the rationalization that Mises has, and this isn't actually the bad rationalization, because almost everyone acts rationally in the fact that they employ means to affect ends.
Yep, praxeology definition of rational.
Yep.
Alternative modes of approaching to the analysis of socialism. There are two ways of treating the problems with which socialism sets to science. The cultural philosopher will examine socialism by trying to place it in order among all other cultural phenomena. He inquires into its intellectual derivation, its relation to all other forms of social life, its hidden sources for the soul. He tries to understand it as a mass phenomena. He examines its effects on religion, philosophy, on art, and literature. He relates it to the natural and mental sciences of the time. He studies its style of life and expression of its ethical and aesthetic beliefs. It is the cultural, historical, psychological way. The failures of this type is not to be ascribed to the incompetence and biases of the practitioners, but also the fact that the sociological economical analysis must precede the cultural, historical, and psychological treatment. I completely agree with analyzing stuff from a sociological and economical thing before worrying about historical and psychological treatments or analyses. So it's not like it's not relevant, but whenever talking about socialism and communism now, the thing that drives me the most crazy is, oh, you think that's a good idea? Hey, what about Soviet Union? What about Russia? What about the USSR? What about Venezuela? Or just, something like that. And it's not that those aren't important or something, but it's like, I much prefer, let's analyze what you're advocating or what this looks like in terms of, what like before we get down the line of like the consequences, like we need to analyze it from an economical and sociological standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's one of my big pet peeves is when people jump to that or something like a historical or something example. Like when it's like, because and then let me expand on that. The reason is because you almost, not that they would, but you almost get the impression from that if things worked out fine, they'd be more open to it or something. I don't think it's like I don't think it's a possibility because of the calculation problem, but it's just like they would be like, well, socialism's bad because a bunch of people died and there was famines or something, versus like, the aggression on private property and the lack of division of labor and all this other stuff. Like it's just because this, like, it had a bad consequence. It's almost like a consequentialist thing.
Mm-hmm. And someone needs to make the argument in an article, but consequentialists really don't have a solid background in why they are the way they are, because you can almost come up with any scenario that could lead you to the consequentialist position of almost anything.
Yeah, but I love Jim Jesus though.
Yeah, I mean, there's some that are better than others, and that's why they stick around as ANCAPs instead of like going off in La La Land. However, it is however, it's not a solid foundation.
No, not at all. I don't care for it whatsoever personally, because it's the whole thing of like, and I'm sure they have a rebuttal for all this stuff, but it's just like you have to care about the means. You can't just care about the ends.
Yep.
Like
you have to be a deontologist.
100%.
The next one it will put into perspective what you just said. So let's continue.
Yeah. All right. A relevant analysis of these prior relations can only be done once it's no longer an obscure conception of its essential reality. This is shown when practitioners of that method conclude that socialism is the final consequence of democracy and equality without understanding what democracy and equality really mean. They refer to socialism being the reaction to the rationalism inseparable from capitalism. Sometimes they assert socialism is the highest form of rationalization of material life. Those who engulf their cultural and theoretical expression of socialism in a chaos of mysticism and incomprehensible phrases need not be addressed here. I loved when I read that part when I was reading the introduction.
Yeah, it's just...
He just straight up tells me.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead. I was just, yeah.
Yeah, he just kind of like dismisses all of this in terms of it's just mysticism and incomprehensible nonsense.
Yeah, like it's been like I'm not even gonna like address that.
Yep.
Thus, this book will address the economic and sociological problems of socialism above all others. Then we can address the cultural and psychological problems. So then we get into chapter 1.
Yep. That's definitely your chapter.
Yeah. You can read some of my notes later on in it, though, that I took. Or a lot of them are all just quotes, basically. But things I thought were very important to talk about. This first one's probably the longest one, and it's because it's the very first thing in the chapter. And it kind of is him just going over what ownership means. So I'm going to read it. Regarded as a sociological category, ownership appears as the power to use economic goods. As an owner is he who disposes of an economic good. Thus, the sociological and juristic concepts of ownership are different. So, real quick, I'm going to interject in his quote. Or maybe I should just keep reading it. But I was going to talk about what we were talking about before we started streaming of just the differences in them. I think he addresses it next. Let me just finish the quote. I just got excited. This, of course, is natural, and one can only be surprised that the fact is sometimes overlooked. From the sociological and economic point of view, ownership is the having of the goods which the economic aims of men require. This having may be called this having may be called the natural or original ownership, as is a purely physical relationship of man to the good, independent of social relations between men of a legal order. The significance of the legal concept of property lies just in this: that it differentiates between the physical has and the legal should have. The law recognizes owners and possessors who lack this natural having, owners who do not have but ought to have. In the eyes of the law, he from whom has been stolen remains the owner, while the thief can never acquire ownership. Economically, however, the natural having alone is relevant, and the economic significance of the legal should have lies only in the support it lends to the acquisition, the maintenance, and the regaining of the natural having.
This is something that I believe Jeff Deist has talked about, in that we should not try to go above and beyond Mises in all things. And in this, I think Hoppe is far closer to Mises than Bloch is when it comes to public property. Public property is not justly owned by the state, but is justly owned by the citizens. And thus, newcomers to the state cannot just appropriate for themselves public property. Instead, it is the citizens who retain ownership. Legal ownership, not, physical ownership, because of course the state controls it.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's one of my favorite things, or why I consider myself a Hoppean. I mean, besides me, thinking argumentation ethics is the best justification and all that, I think that the view, basically what you've just said, of it's not that they have it in their physical possession, but they are, until it is regained. It's just like what the last part was there. It is still more of theirs in a legal sense ownership than it is anyone who has not been robbed from, to put it bluntly, to pay for that.
Yeah, so but the idea of not going above Mises, not trying to at least, is something that is very important, because there is a tendency to read either Rothbard or Hoppe and just some of their works, and not go back to Mises. And I think this should be true of going back to Karl Menger and von Bavrock as well. So it is these original Austrians that have really set the foundation for everything we talk about, and dismissing them just because they're old does not seem to be a worthwhile justification.
Oh yeah, for sure.
This is why I think that regression theorem needs to be given more respect, because it seems like almost everyone has abandoned it in favor of Bitcoin.
I was about to say that, that's one of my things that I still can't get on board with the Bitcoin thing, or I just have so many objections to, is the regression theorem, that it's not tied to any physical good that's ever been used in production. So, I don't know what its original value would be.
Well, and it has nothing to do with original value. It has to do with its being accepted as a currency. And we've seen so far that true free market small businesses have rejected it because of its price instability. But then big companies that are in bed with the government, like PayPal, have adopted it recently. And so it is just showing you that it's not the free market that is adopting Bitcoin, it is the state. And the reason why the state would want to adopt Bitcoin is because it gives the perfect system for digital currency that can always be traced. And it would just increase the surveillance powers of the state.
Oh no, what I meant was like I was just explaining regression theorem and saying that like whatever currency is used has to be tied to some physical good that was used or useful in production.
Right. Yeah, that is true, but I'm going more into like what the conclusion of that is and what the consequences of it is. It's that the free market won't accept it because it lacks that fundamental foundation. It doesn't have a stable price, and because it doesn't have a stable price, even people who bought into it at first have rejected it. For instance, the Bitcoin conference rejects Bitcoin as payment. The city blocks that had accepted Bitcoin in the past in LA have rejected Bitcoin ever since 2018 when it had something like 90% fall off in price in a single day. It wasn't like over a course of months. It was over a single day. It dropped 90%. And you just can't do business like that.
No, not at all.
And this is why I liken it to fiat currency that doesn't have government fiat.
Yeah, well, I mean, it is like I think it is like a fiat currency.
Yeah,
that doesn't have government.
And the real thing about it is it's a mystery box where you know that there's nothing that can be held in the mystery box.
Yeah, not to get off on like a two-thing tangent, but that's why I definitely like think it's got to be like gold, got to be some sort of hard money, got to be something that that.
And I did make a mistake in that first article about money substitutes, because there are also money substitutes in the cryptocurrency world. I just didn't know about them beforehand because I didn't see the point of actually using cryptocurrency for a substitute for gold.
All right. Considered economically, ownership is by no means uniform. Ownership in consumption goods and ownership in consumption goods and ownership in production goods differ in many ways, and in both cases, again, we must distinguish between durable goods and goods that are used up.
Right. And anyways, there's no such thing as a perfectly durable good, though. That's something that we should point out.
I was about to say I don't know if I understand. Like I was about to say, like when I was reading this too, I was like, I don't know if I not necessarily disagree, obviously, with Mises, but I just don't know if I understand what his why would he like what the point of differentiating between the two of them when you could still I don't know.
For instance, it would be impossible for me to rent you a bottle of wine to drink, because once you have drank the wine, it's no longer usable. But I can rent to you a car because a car is durable, at least over the weekend. In that type
No, I understand like the two different classes of goods. I just think it's like getting into ownership or like what his ultimate thing that he's aiming at is like the advocation of the private ownership of the means of production. Like that's what he'll end up advocating for. I just don't like in that sense. To me, it's like not even. It's almost just like it almost adds just another element to be like, well, both the wine and the car should be owned privately. So I wouldn't even, whatever. I just didn't see. I don't get. Not I don't understand the difference. I just don't. He said we must distinguish between them. I just didn't see the significance in distinguishing between some goods that are durable and goods that are used up. In so far as you're trying to make the case of why when you're just talking about ownership.
Oh, it's the type of uses you can have with it.
That's fair. Joint property cannot abolish ownership in consumption of goods. It can only distribute ownership in a way which would not otherwise have existed. Joint property restricts itself, like all other reforms, which stop short at consumption goods, to effecting a different distribution of the existing stock of consumption goods.
Yeah, this is somewhat confusing.
No, I was. That's why I put it in here. I was gonna talk. I just wanted to talk to you about it and say like I wasn't sure what he's trying to say here. Like this, I put a couple of quotes or snippets of things that I don't like. Joint property cannot abolish ownership of consumption goods. Like I'm not sure what that means or what he's like trying to mean from that. Like I know what all the words mean. Obviously, I just don't know like what
ownership, not in the legal sense, but in the physical sense of a consumption good, would mean your ability to, let's say, eat fruit. But just because you have a corporation that's owned by, let's say, 10 people that owns a apple grove won't stop someone from eating an apple. Also, you could have in the legal contract that each person gets so many shares of the apples.
Okay.
So, well, the reason why joint property cannot abolish ownership is important is because it shows that just because corporations exist and there's joint property and such things like that, like in marriage, it's not abolishing private ownership. It's not communal at that point.
Right. Yeah, I get it. I guess yeah. The point is just to say like you could have joint property such as like a company or like what you said like some sort of contract or union, but it doesn't mean that property then is abolished or is meaningless. It just means that you own it jointly with someone.
Yep.
In essence, therefore, natural ownership of production goods is quite different from natural ownership of consumption goods. To have production goods in the economic sense, i.e., is to make them serve one's own economic purpose, is not necessarily to have them physically in the way that one must have consumption goods if one is to use them up or use them lastingly. And I do think it is important to point out the difference, obviously, between like a capital good or a consumptive good or a productive good.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, to avoid any misunderstanding, we will henceforth use the words ownership of the means of production in the generally accepted sense, i.e., to signify the immediate power of disposal. So that's just him clarifying it. So even when we talk about it, which I think it's like in the next sentence, that when we say ownership of means of production, the immediate power, you have the immediate power of disposal.
Yep.
The physical having of economic goods, which economically considered constitutes the essence of natural ownership, can only be conceived as having originated through occupation. Since ownership is not a fact independent of the will and action of man, it is impossible to see how it could have been begun except with the appropriation of ownerless goods. Once begun, ownership continues as long as the object does not vanish until it's either given up voluntarily or the object passes from the physical having of the owner against his will. The first happens when the owner voluntarily gives up his property, the latter when he loses it involuntarily. Example, when cattle stray into the wilds or when some other person forcibly takes the property from him. All ownership derives from occupation and violence.
Yep, there's not really much to say here other than this is just basic what ownership is.
Theory. Yeah, that's just basic property theory. Natural ownership need not court upon recognition by the owner's fellow men. It is tolerated, in fact, as long as there is no power to upset it and does not survive the moment when a stronger man seizes it for himself. Created by arbitrary force, it must always fear a more powerful force. This, the doctrine of natural law, has called the war of all against all. The war ends when the actual relation is recognized as one worthy to be maintained. Out of violence emerges law.
Right, and so this is kind of showing how law is a way of a way of settling disputes. And it's kind of interesting how he defines natural law as the war of all against all. Meanwhile, Hoppe would talk about natural law in the aspect of natural law theory.
What last part again?
So Hoppe would talk about natural law in terms of natural law theory, like Judge Knapp would do. And so it's kind of interesting that Mises doesn't believe in natural law theory despite being a classical liberal. You would think that would be like his jam. You know?
Yeah. Out of violence emerges law is like a super fire quote too.
Mm-hmm.
I also love this next one. All violence is aimed at the property of others. The person, life, and health is the object of attack only insofar as it hinders the acquisition of property. I like it because it kind of reinforces that everything can kind of come from property, or everything is a question of property rights, or therefore scarcity exists. And the way to reduce conflict is to allocate property to everything because it's where all the conflict is over property, basically. But I like Mises' version of it here. All violence is aimed at the property of others. Because if it's at your own property and you destroy it, it's not violence. You know?
Yep.
Some believe that ownership as it shows itself is the distribution of property at a given time may be attacked by pointing out that it has sprung illegally from arbitrary acquisition and violent robbery. According to this view, all legal rights are nothing but time-honored illegality. So since it conflicts with the eternal immutable idea of justice, the existing legal order must be abolished and in its place a new one which shall conform to the idea of justice, that idea of justice. It should not be the task of the state to consider only condition of possession in which it finds its citizens without inquiring into it the legal grounds of acquisition.
So this actually disregards the presumption of innocence that the West has basically held up for hundreds of years. It also shows how this is the era of Marxism, if you remember that speech from Hoppe, where he talks about how just because there are some properties that are ill-gotten does not mean that they are all ill-gotten, nor does it mean that private property must be abolished. Which is, quote-unquote, the era of Marx.
Yeah. Well, they do that purposely is whenever they attack private property, often, well, I'll say most of the time, you see them going after things that even a lot of ANCAPs aren't going to go... Like they'll use examples of like companies that have done really like truly bad things or evil practices or have gotten property or gotten unfair like they've acquired their wealth in really unfair ways that truly maybe violate the NAP or just are immoral in general. And then they'll use this as an example, but realistically, they don't want that's just like they don't want you to have private property, period. So like they're using an example you could agree with, but they want to institute like all this other stuff.
Yep.
So
it's this logical leap that Hoppe talks about. It's a really, really good speech, and if you haven't listened to it, I would definitely suggest giving an hour 2 times in the next week to listen to it twice so you can really understand it, because you can understand why, because he then builds upon what the era is and then builds upon it anarcho-capitalism.
Yeah, I haven't listened to that speech. Is different property and freedom some year? Or is it a
No,
old
it's
Mises?
actually before PFS, if I remember correctly. It is the era of Marxism.
Cool. We'll check it out. We'll link it in the description too.
Yep.
All right. Man's ability to distinguish between justice and injustice is precisely what marks him from the animals. That is his moral nature. So I love that quote as well. That's a really good one. I'm actually going to tweet that out later. Man's ability to distinguish between justice and injustice is precisely what marks him from the animal. So basically, communists aren't people. That is a Mises quote now.
Yeah, yeah, basically.
Peace can only come about when we secure a momentary state of affairs from violent disturbance and make every future change depend upon the consent of the person involved. This is the real significance of the protection of existing rights, which constitutes the kernel of all law.
Yeah, and this actually is starting to sound like an ANCAP Mises.
Yeah, well, but it is, except for two paragraphs ago, the quote where he's talking about the state. He mentions the state. It should not be this task of the state to consider the conditions of possessions, all the stuff. But then, like, the next sentence I didn't put in the notes is like, the role of the state is to protect private property or something like that.
Yep, we should have a protection agency against appropriation. An expropriating protector from expropriation, which is a Hopper type formulation of it.
Yeah. But no, all these thoughts are very you can see where Rothbard just got a hold of this shit. And he just expanded on it. And the foundation, though, from Mises was there, like, all along. Like, this stuff is so good. Like, yeah. The anti-liberal teachings promise everything. They promise. This is a good part. This goes back to when we're talking about the fascism stuff, or even just the communism stuff, about the utopian stuff. Anyway, the anti-liberal teachings promise everything. They promise happiness and spiritual peace, as if a man could be thus blessed from without. Only one thing is certain, that under their ideal social system, the supply of commodities would diminish very considerably.
Yep. Yeah, no, and it's
like they sell it on this, like, it's going to be this great place and all this, it's going to have this one, everything you're going to have. It's going to be the will of the people. It's going to be a homeland just for us to have our collective future, or whoever's selling it, whatever group it is. It's just like, okay, how are you going to know how much wheat to produce without a market signal?
Right.
Like,
also, it kind of shows, because how they'll frame this is in terms of materialism, and it really shows it's the socialists that happiness and spiritual peace is brought about by material well-being, and it's not really the capitalists that claim that.
Right. There's a lot of projection and that stuff too. Like, a lot of we should read. Have you guys read the Anti-Capitalist Mentality?
Oh yes, we have. That's the
that's the first. Then that's the first Mises book. Then we forgot about that.
Yeah.
I wasn't in that one, but yeah, it's like a lot of it's this projection on capitalism.
Yeah, and I really liked it because it was basically insulting non-Austrians, the book. No.
The last resort of the critics of the liberal ideal of society is to attempt to destroy it with weapons it itself provides. They seek to prove that it serves and wants to serve only the interest of a single classes, that the peace for which it seeks favors only a restricted circle and is harmful to all others, even the social order achieved. Well, I'm going to stop there because I forgot how long this is. It's on the next page. But yeah, that's totally true. You see that now. Oh, like capitalism or whatever it is, like free market only benefits, this class. It only benefits this single interest. And yeah, right. It creates peace, but only for this group or something. It's like, no.
Right, and
like it's the whole thing of trade and both parties benefiting.
They'll even say that the end results of capitalism is to empower the state to pick winners and losers. That's something I saw this morning. I just had to bring it up.
But yeah, and a lot of that is they don't understand profit, or they don't understand that
regulatory capture. They don't understand how all of this came to be. They don't understand how the robber barons came to be, that they were given government grants and government monopolies on railroads. So
yeah, well, I was just saying even more basic than that. They don't even understand how trade benefits both parties. So they'll say, yeah, of course capitalism benefits. Look how rich they got off of this stuff. And it's like, how'd they get the money? Like in a American market.
Right.
Like they provide a value to you. They don't only see it one direction.
It's not just money and how you profit. It is also from enjoyment, from the use of food, feeling full. And that's the sort of thing that people profit from.
Yeah, psychic profit, man. Like Konkin, bro. Even the social order achieved in the constitutional modern state is based on violence. Based? Yo, Spooner? What? Mises was such an anarchist and didn't even know it, bro.
Yeah, no, he's like 5 steps away from becoming Rothbard.
Even the social order achieved in the constitutional modern state is based on violence. The free contracts on which it pretends to rest are really, they say, only the conditions of peace dictated by the victors to the vanquished. The terms being valid as long as the power from which they spring continues and no longer. Dude, that's so good.
Yeah, no, it's so not something you would expect to hear from a non-anarchist.
No, not for sure. That's so good. All ownership is founded on violence and maintained by violence. I don't know about that. I mean, maybe I don't know how he's wording it or what he means by that. In the sense it's maintained by violence, in the sense that like you have to defend it or someone can just take it from you.
Yep.
But
yeah, and it's going to be kind of impossible to have a pure homesteaded property with the fact of so much violence in the past, of serfdom and all of that. It's just not really possible to detach ourselves from the moral follies of past generations. That's how I would view it. We know that almost all of the property in Europe, for instance, was expropriated from someone. We just don't know who did it to whom.
Perhaps the strongest of the imperialist arguments is an argument which derives from a total misconception of the essence of the ownership of the means of production in a society dividing labor. There's a lot of ofs. Hold on, I'm going to read that again. Perhaps the strongest of the imperialist arguments is an argument which derives from a total misconception of the essence of the ownership of the means of production in a society dividing labor. It regards one of the most important tasks to the It regards as one of its most important tasks to the provision of the nation with its own coal mines, own sources of raw material, own ships, own ports. It's clear that such an argument proceeds from the view that natural ownership in these means of production is undivided and that only those benefit from them who have them physically. Yeah, okay, that's a really good point.
Mm-hmm. And it really beat TFOs the protectionists.
Yeah, 100%. And in theory, for sure. And then you could also just even see in practice how, free trade benefits it. Or you could even just do the thought experiment of like, so a town would have to have their own, you know, you know, car factory or something. Like I was trying to think of something super obscure. Like they'd have to, like, every car in the town have to be made in that town or something. Like they couldn't. That'd be the most economically beneficial thing, is for every town to have their own car manufacturer or plant, or every country to have their own thing, rather than just like having the division of labor and comparative advantage and all that other stuff.
Yeah.
It's just
I think he's going to get into how this would break down the division, the specialization and division of labor.
That's one thing that that still persists today, and it persists a lot like on the populist right, who obviously I like a lot, but just like the idea that like if we don't buy this American thing, if we get this good from somewhere else, then like that's bad because we're now lost. We've lost out or something in some way. Like I don't.
Well, I mean, how should I put this? There is some very limited truth to that, in the fact that factory work and such has basically made a comparative advantage with other countries for factory work. And typically when they come over here, what they do is build mansions and houses and such for immigrants. That which just pushes the labor wages down. So it's not like permanent okay, how should I put this? Because of the funny money the Fed prints out, the way international trade works today does not work like how it works in economic textbooks, where you'll put money in, let's say, making shoes into France, and France will put into America money for making like shorts. It doesn't work like that. It works,
Yeah.
It's all distorted. And so
no,
good.
I understand that we have a trade deficit and all that stuff, but we still have the goods that we.
Right, you still have cheap goods, and that's one of the major benefits. It's just that people will treat it as if you have this cycling economy of being an exporter and an importer, but it's because of the interventions that's not really true. And it's just slightly more nuanced than standard economic theory, like that you would have in economics in one lesson would teach you, but it's still largely true. It's just like...
Yeah, well, all the interventions certainly they magnify the problems.
Yep.
The earliest attempts to reform ownership and property can be accurately described as attempts to achieve the greatest possible equality in the distribution of wealth, whether or not they claim to be guided by considerations of social unity or social justice. All should possess a certain minimum, none more than a certain maximum. All should possess the same amount. That was roughly the aim. That was roughly the aim. The means to this end were not always the same. Confiscation of all or part of the property was usually proposed, followed by redistribution. A world populated only by self-sufficient agriculturalists, leaving room for at most a few artisans. That was the ideal society towards which one strove.
And so this is the destruction of the division and specialization of labor I talked about earlier.
Yeah.
So let's continue.
It's hardly necessary to prove today that it is impossible to found on a it is hardly necessary to prove today that it is impossible to found on a land and homestead communism a social organization capable of supporting the hundreds of millions of the white race.
Ooh, Mises, the original alt-writer.
Um, yeah, but this kind of like BTFO is like Nas bullshit.
Yeah. I just remember seeing that and being like, someone's actually talking about the right race. Get the SPLC on Mises.
Yeah, yeah. To abolish private property and the means of production, to make the means of production the property of the community. That's the whole aim of socialism. That's a pretty popular quote of his.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not like anything revelatory per se, but just that's a just a really solid quote, and it's exactly what it is, but it's never when you ask them what it is. That's very rarely. I like honest communists who just say that, but a lot of people you ask what is it's communism or democratic socialism or anything, and it's like, oh, it just means everyone should have enough dignity to live, or no one should be too poor to live. It just means.
I actually like, skipped over that in the introduction, I believe. But yeah, they believe in some weird bullshit.
And it's like, no, to abolish private property and the means of production and make them property of the community. That's the whole aim of socialism. Like, that's what it is. Just say that. Say you want to do that. Just say it. Like, it's always presented as
bullshit.
It's always presented as like, we just want, no one in a modern society, it's the year 2020, it's the current year, no one should be too, everyone should have a standard of living. Or it's like, just say you want to abolish private property, please. It makes it easier.
Yeah.
Socialism seeks to abolish trade otherwise than by abolishing the division of labor and returning to the autarky of the self-contained family economy, or at least to the simpler exchange organization of the self-sufficient agrarian district. Yeah, we talked about this.
This is how you get your agrarian communism that Mao believed in.
Yep. Liberal doctrine has stressed the important part played in the evolution of civilization by private property and the means of production. Socialism might have contested itself with denying the use of maintaining the institution of ownership any longer, without denying at the same time the usefulness of this ownership in the past. So that's something, and a lot of Marxists and communists admit this, that in order to bring about what they're talking about, it wouldn't be possible without the standard of living being set by capitalism in the first place. Or without like a system of private property being a first condition. And I think Marx even said that about how like when it's in like stages, and like this stage has to precede socialism. Like private property ownership has to exist before socialism. And that basically is what Mises was saying right there. It's useful. It's been useful in the past, but it does not. He says it's played an important part in the evolution of society. I don't forget where I was going with that, but that's what the quote is that I read. And I think that's all the notes I took on that chapter. I don't know if you have any other ones.
I was trying to find what we were just talking about with the
agrarian district stuff.
No, the right to equitable distribution.
Oh, right. Yeah, I think that's in the intro, yeah.
Oh, it's in the intro?
I thought so. I read them in 2 different days. Yeah. Actually, I can just control search it, probably, in the PDF. I read it in the actual book, but I have the PDF here.
Yeah. Same, actually. We still don't have any more comments, so can't waste time on that. Oh, 1 second. It's not in chapter 1. You know what it's in?
Oh, it's in the chapter 2 that you read ahead?
Yep. Yeah, so that's going to be something for next week. Okay. It makes sense because it has nothing to do with ownership. Yeah, it's section 2 of chapter 2, the fundamental rights of socialist theory.
Oh yeah, okay. I haven't gotten there, but I thought you briefly mentioned it in the intro at some point. But yeah, that is just something that I know from their thing of like a right is just I'm entitled to this much of property,
Your stuff.
yeah, I'm entitled to your stuff.
Yeah, so yeah, next week we will be going after chapter 2 and chapter 3.
I'm excited.
And then I believe, yeah, then we'll be going after chapter 4 and then part 2, chapter 1 of the next thing of the economics of a socialist community and the nature of economic activity. I can't wait for chapter 4 of this part because it's the social order and the family, and you have things like socialism and the sexual problem, man and woman in the age of violence, which Hoppe talks about in A Short History of Man, as well as the great fiction, marriage under the influence of the idea of contract, the problems of married life, free love, and prostitution.
A lot of that is probably had excerpts that were in that cultural views thing. I'm sure, right?
Yep, that's almost
free love
exclusively what it comes from. But
nice.
Yeah, he talks about free love, which is what we talked about last time in the last episode. He talks about the
socialists being opposed to marriage is.
Yep, and just having free love, and then he also talks about prostitution, which I can't wait till he just calls them a bunch of harlots.
That doesn't seem very socially liberal and fiscally conservative. That's what I was told libertarianism meant.
Yeah. Mac is going to beat you. Actually, no. Mac is going to have Josh beat you. Because that's why she married a big man. Instead, she can have him beat up other people.
Smart. That's thinking evolutionarily.
Yep.
Strategically.
Anyways, do we have any questions, guys? I don't even know who's watching at this point.
I only have the Google Doc up. I haven't even checked the stream.
It says we have 1 viewer.
Hell yeah. And it's you.
Well, I've had it paused, and I have no idea what that does to the statistics. But yeah.
I'm excited to get into chapter 2, bud, because I just it's not like it's not important to go over the basics because you have to have the foundation of ownership. But I think part 2 is just called, the beginning of it's just called socialism.
Yeah, I actually disagree with Bob Murphy here. And I believe that this book is more important to learn as a to read as a libertarian than the theory of money and credit. Because he's an economist. Right, I believe if you're going as an economist, it would make sense. But if you're just a libertarian, I think this book would really cement it. Because he doesn't just talk about economics here. He also talks about other, like, sociology and things like that.
Right. Yeah.
And so, what he did was, he had, for Mises, I believe, in his 5 books for libertarians, he had, for Mises, I believe he had Human Action and the Theory of Money and Credit. And I would totally do Human Action in this book.
Yeah, we should do Human Action on the book club.
Well, that's the plan.
Yeah, I mean, then that'll just be a whole year.
Oh no, actually, it's going to be half of a year.
Nice.
We already planned this out. I don't know if you were around when we were planning this, but
I wasn't. No.
We have 3 years planned of episodes.
Was the first book Economics in One Lesson?
Yes.
I feel, and I'm not going to critique you guys because you got your plan out, but I feel like maybe you should have started with like Menger or something.
Actually, we've been trying to figure out how to fit in principles of economics in here, but we wanted to start off light and then get into heavier and heavier
Well,
stuff.
that's true. I mean, starting with economics one lessons makes sense because of the writing style versus like reading something as old as like Origin of Money or Principles in Economics, but or Marx and the Close of His System. You know, those are like a lot more.
Yeah.
Any book that has to be translated from German or something like.
Yeah. So the idea was that we're going to have 3 years following the 3 most influential libertarians. Because at the end of his life, Mises also called himself a libertarian, or at least hung out with a bunch of people who did. And so he. So we were going to do a year of Mises, a year of Rothbard, and then a year of Hoppe.
Fuck yeah, I can't wait for that.
Yeah, and we were thinking like maybe in between the years, we might do like principles of economics or the economic science and the Austrian method, because that's very important. And I kind of
and that's a quick read. I think that's a really you can do that in like two or 3 episodes.
Yeah, well, it's not just that, but also I want to compare I want to do it right after we do Mises's book on the epistemological problems in economics and philosophy. And then go into economic science and the Austrian method and show any differences with Mises and the similarities. Because Mises doesn't just like talk about the Austrian method, but he also critiques a lot of things in that book, and I think that's a very good book to understand as a libertarian, not just as an economist, because you could go just the straight Austrian economics route, but that's somewhat less interesting to me because I don't want to become just an economist.
Right. No, for sure.
I just want to be good enough that like I can't be confused about things.
Yeah. Have you ever studied like catalactics and stuff?
Catalactics and coladics, somewhat. Actually, before we did Human Action, we were going to read Bob Murphy's book Choice, and that's going to be the next book after this.
Oh, cool! I have that book.
Yep. So we're going to go.
Wait, so you guys are going to do Choice and Human Action?
Yeah.
Nice.
Then after Human Action, we're going to do Man, Economy, and State, and then we're going to go back to Mises for the epistemological problems in economics, and then we're going to do economic science in the Austrian method. Then we're going to go back to Rothbard and either do the progressive era or the progressive era or America's Great Depression.
Nice.
And then somewhere in between Man, Economy, and State and the economic history, we're going to do egalitarianism as we revolt against nature.
Nice.
Which is just a single episode because it's 20-something pages long. Yeah, because Rothbard, in my opinion,
I didn't know if you're going to do the whole thing with the other essays and all that.
Yeah, in my opinion, Rothbard has way more important essays than he does books. But I also haven't read a lot of his books. I've only read pieces of Man, Economy, and State, and then the entirety of The Betrayal of the American Right. And then we're going to end on The Betrayal of American Right for Rothbard, and then go into Hoppe, Democracy, the God That Failed, the Ethics and Economics of Private Property, and also the Theory of Socialism and Capitalism. Not necessarily in that order.
Yeah, those are all solid.
Yeah. But that's a 3-year, like, kind of general plan. Well, I'm kind of hoping it gets interrupted by book suggestions, because the book suggestions, the one suggestion we've had so far has been amazing.
We could read Anatomy of the State. Like we could read it live, like the whole thing on an episode, because I think you can read it in like 60 minutes or something.
Yeah, that would be another good one. It's also kind of like an essay.
Yeah, and I think it's about an hour to read it. I mean, I've read it twice, and that's about how long it took me. And
yeah,
I think then we could like read it and stop and like talk about it directly, like from the book. Make about a good like 2-hour episode or whatever, 3-hour episode, just reading the whole thing. Because he covers a lot of different stuff in that, even though it's short. I think he doesn't get super in depth on any one thing. I think he kind of goes over all the basic roles, or and like what the state is not and that kind of stuff. I think that's a good one to do after Mises.
Okay.
Especially because it'll be diverging from, I think it'd be the first anarchist book, right? So going from like a lot of the classical liberalism stuff with like all the Mises books and the economics in one lesson stuff, and then kind of like transitioning into like, okay, well here's the deal with the state though.
Yeah. Power and Markets also does that from a main economy and state.
Oh yeah. Well, I haven't forgot that.
When I meant main economy and state, I meant the full main economy and state that Rothbard wanted to write.
Yeah, the version I have has Power and Market as well, but I haven't even finished Man Economy and State.
Oh, the crazy thing is that when I'm not doing these book clubs, what I do instead is I read specific chapters of things I want to learn about.
Interesting. I don't do that because I kind of think about it like, I know, but it's different in these contexts. But I kind of think about it like a movie where I like want to start it from the beginning. So like if I don't finish it, I'm just like, I got to pick up from there instead of just being like, I don't need to read about this, but I do want to know about this thing, and I'll just skip to that chapter. I don't think about that, but that's probably a really good idea.
Right. So in some of my technical books I have for work, there's actual prerequisites for certain chapters. And so if you go to the introduction of the book, it'll have like a spreadsheet of like what is required for each chapter. And it'll even have like, let's say you have a multi-volume series of books, it'll tell you what chapters from which books is necessary for this chapter.
Nice. That's convenient.
And so that's how I kind of dealt with main economy and principles of economics, is I would read something, not quite understand what it means because I don't know the technical definition of what something it's saying. I will go to the index for when it uses that word, and then go to that chapter and read that chapter to understand what that word means. And then if there's other things I don't understand from that I'll just keep, it's just a recursive process of going back and back and back.
Right. Well, it's been good doing that book club this week with you, Colton.
Yep.
I'm about to jump off here, but I'll see you next week with the second chapter.
Of course.
Are we doing second and third? Was that it? Second and third together?
Yep, we're doing second and third, which won't be as bad.
Yeah. The preface and the introduction were kind of like made it a lot. But this will be nice, and we've already got the foundations established, so we'll just knock. And then plus a lot of the stuff in the third chapter sounds like it's going to be fun to talk about.
The fourth chapter, right?
Oh, that's the fourth. Okay, never mind. That'll be a really good one then. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah. Chapter 2 is Socialism, and Chapter 3 is the Social Order and the Political Constitution.
That one does sound boring, but we'll get into it, I guess.
Yeah. It's going to be interesting how Mises defines democracy and equality such that the socialists aren't egalitarians.
Right. Interesting.
Yeah.
All right, buddy.
All right. We'll see you next week.
Later,
also, Bort, do you want to show what you're going on?
Oh, tonight?
Yeah.
Oh, just Dissecting Liberty. It's a cotton anarchists show.
Yep. So
that should be fun.
One of the few libertarians that have me blocked.
Well, I'll talk to him about it. I'll bring it up immediately.
Yeah,
Also do
just
my
go on a show and immediately be belligerent.
But yeah, and if you guys want to follow me, you can follow me
Oh,
at NeoconRover on Twitter.
yep. And I'm at Hetz You Very Much. I'm Colton. Also, who is it? Portal. Is Portal also on that show?
No, his is Insurrection Inc.
Okay. I
And
didn't
did
know
you know
if
that
like he had
Porter
a...
hasn't just had? Did you know Porter just got an article published on Mises on Saturday?
No, but that doesn't
Yeah,
surprise me because he went to Mises U.
yeah, that's super awesome. I'm stoked for him.
Portal
But
is
yeah,
also
he was
the
he.
other guy that has me blocked.
Man, dude, you're popular.
Yeah, it was because he started going to um agorism and
Yeah,
yeah, and I just kept just saying like agorism is not just like fishing without a license or like not, just skimping
yeah.
on
There's a whole
taxes.
class theory.
Yeah, there's a class theory, there's an agora theory, there's so much stuff
Um,
that goes along with it.
well, Porter is going to be one of the hosts when I'm debating Ace.
Nice.
So and then the other host is an agorist as well. So it's gonna be 3-1. I think they're gonna moderate, but still.
Right, but it's not going to be a it's definitely a hostile environment.
No, they love me. Who doesn't?
Yep.
I'm gonna win. I'm gonna win them over, bro.
You're gonna subvert the agorists into becoming Hoppeans through memes.
That's been my plan since I made a Twitter account. All right, buddy. I got to bounce, but it's been great talking to you.
Yep. See ya.